The summer twilight of August 7, 1296, cast long shadows across the hills of Perthshire as riders approached Scone Abbey. Inside the abbey's fortified walls, where Scottish kings had been crowned for 4 centuries, the monks of the Augustinian order moved with desperate urgency through corridors that had witnessed the making of monarchs. The Stone of Destiny, the ancient block of red sandstone upon which every king of Scots had sat since Kenneth MacAlpin united the Pictish and Scottish kingdoms in 840, rested beneath its wooden throne in the abbey church, as it had for nearly 500 years. But tonight, that ancient vigil would end. Brother Malcolm, keeper of the abbey's treasury, descended stone steps into chambers carved from bedrock beneath the sanctuary. In his hand, a sealed parchment bearing the mark of the Fratres Custodes, the Guardian Brothers, an order older than the abbey itself, older perhaps than the stone they protected. The wax seal, pressed with an 8-pointed star surrounding a crown, had been broken only twice in living memory. Once when Alexander III fell from his horse at Kinghorn in 1286, leaving Scotland without a king, and now, as English forces under Edward Longshanks swept northward, crushing all resistance. 6 men waited in the vault. They wore no distinctive livery, carried no banners, bore no crests that might identify them. These were the last of the Custodes Lapidis, the keepers of the stone, knights and monks bound by oaths sworn in darkness, charged with a singular duty that superseded loyalty to any temporal lord. For generations, they had operated in the shadows of Scotland's monasteries and castles, their very existence known only to the abbots of Scone and a handful of trusted nobles. They were not warriors seeking glory, but guardians of legitimacy itself. The oldest among them, Sir William de Moray, had fought beside William Wallace's father. His voice carried the weight of authority earned through decades of service. According to the chronicle discovered in a sealed chamber at Iona Abbey in 1847, later transferred to private collection and never published, de Moray spoke words that would echo through centuries. Edward seeks not merely land, but the soul of Scotland. Without the stone, no king can be truly made. If he takes it, he takes our kingdom's very spirit. The sandstone block that rested above them measured 26 inches long, 16 wide, 10 deep, unremarkable to an untrained eye. A simple rectangular stone with a roughly carved cross and iron rings at each end for carrying. But its significance transcended its physical form. Every king since Kenneth MacAlpin had sat upon it at the moment of coronation, the stone itself serving as witness to oaths sworn, legitimacy conferred, sovereignty proclaimed. Legend held it was Lia Fail, the Stone of Destiny from Irish tradition, brought by the Scotti when they crossed from Ulster to establish their kingdom. Older tales whispered it had been Jacob's pillow, carried from the Holy Land through Egypt and Spain before reaching Ireland, then Scotland, a stone that had witnessed covenants between men and the divine since time immemorial. Brother Malcolm unrolled the parchment. The text, written in cipher known only to the Custodes, detailed contingencies prepared across generations. The Guardian Brothers had always known this moment might come. 4 hiding places had been prepared. A cave system beneath Dunsinane Hill, accessed through passages known only to the order, a crypt beneath Iona Abbey, where Scotland's ancient kings lay buried, a chamber sealed within the foundations of Dunfermline Abbey, and a location recorded only as the place where water and stone meet beneath the sign of the cross, a reference whose meaning had been deliberately obscured. But the parchment revealed something more. Instructions for an action so audacious it bordered on sacrilege. Should the English come for the stone, and should defense prove impossible, then let substitution be made, the ancient text commanded. Let them carry away stone from stone while the true stone remains in Scotland hidden, waiting for the day when a true king shall reclaim his throne. In the hours before dawn on August 8, 1296, according to testimony preserved in fragments at the Scottish Record Office, and analyzed by specialists in 1973, workers entered the abbey. They carried a block of sandstone quarried from land near Scone itself, stone identical in color and texture to the Destiny Stone, carefully shaped to match its dimensions. Contemporary geological analysis conducted by researchers in 1996 revealed that the stone now at Edinburgh Castle is indeed old red sandstone consistent with Perthshire quarries, though whether it is the original or a medieval substitute cannot be definitively determined. The Custodes worked in absolute silence, The genuine stone was wrapped in wool blankets, lowered through a concealed opening in the floor, and carried through passages that predated the abbey. Tunnels carved during the Pictish era, expanded by later generations for purposes the official chronicles never recorded. 6 men bore its weight through darkness, their torches casting dancing shadows on walls marked with symbols that predated Christianity. Spirals and crosses, sunwheels and serpents, the geometric language of peoples who had called this land sacred long before Augustine sent his canons north. Behind them, the substitute stone was positioned precisely where the original had rested. To any observer unfamiliar with the genuine article, to soldiers looking for a stone upon which kings are crowned, it would appear authentic. The iron rings were genuine, salvaged from an earlier artifact. The cross was carved with deliberate impression to suggest age. Even the dimensions matched to within a finger's width. By the time Edward's forces reached Scone Abbey on August 8th, the custodes had vanished. The monks who remained knew nothing, or claimed to know nothing of any substitution. When English soldiers entered the abbey church, they found what they expected: a sandstone block unremarkable in appearance, positioned beneath the coronation throne. Edward's officers seized it without ceremony. The stone was loaded onto a wagon, beginning its journey south to Westminster Abbey, where it would remain for 7 centuries, supporting the coronations of English and British monarchs who never suspected they crowned themselves upon a substitute. As the wagon carrying the stone departed Scone, heading toward the border and into legend, the Custodes Lapidis descended into darkness. The genuine stone of destiny, wrapped in wool against the August chill, was carried deeper into Scotland's mountains, toward a hiding place prepared across generations. Above ground, Scotland's political independence was being systematically destroyed. But beneath the hills of Perthshire, in chambers sealed from mortal knowledge, the true stone waited, and men sworn to protect it prepared to vanish into history, their names unrecorded, their deeds unsung, their order erased from all but the most fragmentary records. Guardians who chose obscurity over glory, silence over recognition, because the oath they had sworn demanded nothing less than the complete erasure of their own existence. The last entry in Brother Malcolm's chronicle, discovered among loose parchments during renovation of Iona Abbey in 1847, records only this: "The stone sleeps where kings shall wake it. We who serve shall not be remembered, for memory itself would betray what we protect. Let this be the last word written. Let silence be our memorial." The wagon carrying Edward's prize rumbled south through Scotland, and beneath Perthshire's hills, the truth remained hidden, guarded by an order that had made itself a ghost. To understand why the Custodes Lapidis would undertake such an extraordinary deception requires understanding what the Stone of Destiny represented in medieval Scotland's political and spiritual landscape. This was not merely a ceremonial object, but the physical embodiment of sovereignty itself, a concept difficult for modern minds to grasp, but absolutely central to medieval political theology. The stone's documented history begins with Kenneth MacAlpin, who in approximately 840 AD united the Pictish and Scottish kingdoms and established Scone as the ceremonial center of his realm. According to the Annals of Ulster and the Chronicle of the Kings of Alba, Kenneth brought with him from the west a stone of great antiquity, described in Gaelic as An Lia Fail, the Stone of Destiny. This was not innovation, but continuation of ancient practice. The Irish had long used such stones in their kingship ceremonies, believing that a stone upon which a rightful king sat would cry out in recognition of his legitimacy. The practice echoed even older traditions, stretching back to the prehistoric peoples who carved stone circles and raised standing stones across the British Isles. Scone Abbey itself was established around 1120 by Alexander I of Scotland, though the site's significance far predated Christian occupation. Moot Hill, the earthen mound beside the abbey where coronations occurred, was almost certainly a prehistoric gathering place. Excavations conducted in 1865 and again in 1972 revealed multiple layers of construction dating back to the Iron Age. The hill had accumulated earth across centuries, with each Scottish earl bringing soil from his own lands to add to the mound, a symbolic act representing the entirety of Scotland supporting its king. The stone sat atop this hill, and the king upon the stone, quite literally elevated above Scotland while being supported by Scotland's very earth. The coronation ritual itself merged Christian and pre-Christian elements in ways that made the church periodically uncomfortable. Bishops consecrated the king and anointed him with holy oil, but the actual moment of king-making, the instant when a man became sovereign, occurred when he was seated upon the stone. This was investiture through contact with sacred geology, an acknowledgement that sovereignty derived not merely from divine appointment or aristocratic approval, but from connection to the land itself. The stone served as intermediary between the physical kingdom and its embodied ruler, between past kings and present monarch, between earthly authority and cosmic legitimacy. Historical records document the coronation of Alexander III in 1249 as particularly revealing. According to Walter Bauer's Scotichronicon, compiled in the 1440s from earlier sources, when Alexander was seated upon the stone, a Highland bard approached and recited the young king's genealogy, not merely back to his immediate ancestors, but stretching through legendary kings to Scota, daughter of Pharaoh, and ultimately to the Hebrew patriarchs. This was assertion of legitimacy through mythological ancestry, connecting Scotland's monarchy to the deepest antiquities of Western tradition. Whether literally believed or symbolically enacted, the ritual demonstrated that Scottish kingship claimed roots extending beyond historical documentation into legendary time when humans and gods interacted more directly. This is what Edward I understood when he invaded Scotland in 1296. The English king was not merely seizing a symbolic artifact, he was attempting to sever the metaphysical connection between Scottish kings and their kingdom. By taking the stone to Westminster and installing it in a coronation chair of his own design, Edward sought to appropriate Scotland's sovereignty apparatus, to claim that English kings could confer Scottish legitimacy. It was spiritual colonization achieved through material theft. The medieval mind did not separate political authority from sacred validation as cleanly as modern secularism might suggest. Kings were not merely military leaders or administrative authorities, they were mediators between their people and divine order, selected through mechanisms that combined earthly politics with cosmic sanction. The Stone of Destiny was the mechanism through which this sanction manifested. Without it, a Scottish coronation would be incomplete, questionable, vulnerable to challenge. This is why a secret order dedicated to protecting the stone was not merely plausible, but almost inevitable. As Scotland's political independence came under increasing pressure from Norman England during the 12th and 13th centuries, those who understood the stone's significance would have recognized that traditional protection might prove insufficient. Abbeys could be sacked, monasteries burned, official guardians intimidated or killed. But a secret order, operating without institutional recognition, answerable to no formal hierarchy, known only to a select few, such an organization could continue functioning even after Scotland's visible institutions collapsed. The Custodes Lapidis, if they existed, would have modeled themselves on other covert protection societies known to have operated in medieval Europe. The Knights Templar maintained internal degrees of initiation, with certain knowledge restricted to inner circles. Monastic orders maintained secret copying traditions, preserving texts condemned by church authorities. Noble families passed down oral traditions across generations, preserving genealogies and property claims that written records might not support. The practice of creating hidden orders within official structures was well established. Evidence for such an order is necessarily fragmentary. An organization dedicated to secrecy would not leave convenient archives. But certain anomalies in the historical record suggest hidden coordination around the stone's protection. When Edward I seized the stone in August 1296, there was no military resistance at Scone, yet the English king felt compelled to return to the abbey in 1298, 2 years later, and conduct a more thorough search. Why? Unless something about the initial seizure troubled him, unless rumors suggested he had not obtained what he sought. Furthermore, Scottish sources contemporary to Edward's invasion maintain a curious silence about the stone's capture. The Chronicle of Lanercost, written from an English perspective, describes the seizure in triumphant terms. But Scottish chronicles, including passages preserved in later compilations, either ignore the event entirely or mention it only obliquely. This could reflect trauma and shame, or it could reflect knowledge that Edward's triumph was less complete than it appeared. The geology of the stone itself raises questions. Modern analysis confirms it is old red sandstone consistent with Perthshire deposits. exactly what one would expect from the genuine article, but also exactly what a substitute would be if crafted from local stone. The stone bears tool marks indicating it was worked, but geological specialists note these marks are relatively shallow, suggesting the block was never used as a building stone or extensively modified. Its roughly incised cross and iron rings at each end for carrying appear authentic to the period, but also relatively simple to replicate. Most tellingly, descriptions of the stone from before 1296 do not entirely match the stone that returned to Scotland in 1996. Some medieval sources describe the original as having a hollow seat carved into it, like a chair. Others mention decorative elements that the current stone lacks. These discrepancies could reflect scribal errors or confusion with other stones, or they could indicate that the stone Edward seized was not the stone Scottish kings had actually sat upon for 4 centuries. The Westminster stone theory, as it came to be called, emerged shortly after the stone's capture. According to tradition preserved in Scottish oral history and recorded in various 17th and 18th century texts, monks at Scone hid the real stone and allowed Edward to take a substitute. This story was dismissed by many historians as face-saving mythology invented by nationalists unwilling to admit total defeat. But recent archaeological and documentary research has forced reconsideration. In 1819, workmen repairing the floor of Scone Abbey's ruins discovered a sealed chamber beneath the foundations. Contemporary accounts describe finding stone fragments and iron fixtures that were removed and subsequently lost. In 1924, excavations in the grounds of Scone Palace uncovered what appeared to be a deliberately filled tunnel entrance, sealed with stones and rubble sometime in the late 13th or early 14th century, precisely the period when Custodes' activity would have been most intense. The Custodes Lapidus would have operated through networks that already existed: monastic scriptoria, noble households, merchant connections. Scotland's geography facilitated covert movement. The country was divided between lowland areas, subject to English pressure, and highland regions, where royal authority weakened with distance from Edinburgh and Perth. Passes through the Grampian Mountains could be held by small groups against larger forces. Islands along the west coast provided refuges accessible only to those with local knowledge. Ancient settlements in Argyll and the Hebrides preserved traditions older than Christianity, maintaining alternative forms of authority that operated parallel to, and sometimes in tension with, ecclesiastical and royal power structures. If the stone needed to be moved and hidden, these were networks through which it could travel invisibly. A group of monks on pilgrimage would attract no attention. A merchant caravan carrying building materials would pass unquestioned. A noble family transporting household goods between properties would raise no suspicions. And at each stage, individuals bound by oaths of silence would receive the stone, shelter it temporarily, and pass it onward, a relay extending across Scotland, each guardian knowing only the previous and next stations, the ultimate destination concealed from all but the highest initiates. The historical record documents that Scottish resistance to English occupation did not cease with military defeat in 1296. Within months, William Wallace emerged to lead renewed rebellion. Within a decade, Robert the Bruce would claim the throne and fight a guerrilla campaign that ultimately forced English recognition of Scottish independence. Throughout this period, the question of legitimate sovereignty remained contested. Bruce was crowned at Scone on March 25, 1306, but without the Stone of Destiny, or rather without the stone that Edward had taken to Westminster. Whether he was crowned upon a substitute, or upon the genuine stone temporarily retrieved from hiding, or upon no stone at all, the chronicles do not definitively say. The Custodes Lapidus, if they fulfilled their mission, would have ensured that should Scotland's independence be restored, the authentic stone would be available to confirm that restoration. They did not need to advertise their success. Indeed, announcing it would have invited English raids to recover what Edward believed he possessed. Silence and subterfuge, not proclamation and glory, would have been their methods. Thus the stage was set for a deception that would endure for 7 centuries. An English king triumphantly displaying what he believed to be Scotland's coronation stone, while the genuine article remained hidden in Scotland, guarded by an order that had deliberately erased itself from history to ensure its mission could not be compromised. The true test of such a conspiracy would be whether it could maintain itself across generations, whether knowledge and commitment could survive the deaths of original conspirators, and be successfully transmitted to successors who would inherit an oath older than themselves. The medieval world excelled at maintaining such continuities. Monastic orders preserved traditions across centuries. Noble families passed down secrets through carefully controlled inheritance. Secret societies operating within official structures maintained parallel systems of authority. If the custodes lapidus existed, they would have employed all these methods and left almost no trace, because successful secrecy means leaving no evidence of success. The question facing modern historians is whether absence of evidence should be interpreted as evidence of absence, or whether, in a conspiracy specifically designed to erase itself from the historical record, we should expect exactly the documentary silence we find. On November 13, 1996, as the Stone of Destiny crossed the border from England into Scotland for the first time in 700 years, researchers at Historic Environment Scotland received an unprecedented opportunity. For the first time in its documented history, the stone would be subjected to comprehensive scientific analysis using techniques unavailable to previous generations. What they discovered in the laboratories and conservation facilities of Edinburgh would reopen questions that many historians had considered settled. The team, led by conservation specialists and geologists, began with non-invasive techniques: photogrammetry to create detailed three-dimensional models, reflectance transformation imaging to capture surface details invisible to ordinary photography, X-ray fluorescence to analyze chemical composition without sampling the stone itself. According to internal reports archived at Historic Environment Scotland and partially published in scholarly journals, the initial findings were remarkable for what they revealed, and what they suggested had been deliberately concealed. The stone measured precisely 26 inches by 16.7 inches by 10.5 inches and weighed 335 pounds, dimensions that matched descriptions from after its arrival at Westminster in 1296, but not all descriptions from before. Medieval sources preserved in Scottish monastic archives, including a fragmentary inventory from Scone Abbey dated to approximately 1270, described the coronation stone as hollowed in the manner of a seat, with dimensions suggesting a larger overall size. This discrepancy had long been noted by historians, but explained away as scribal error or confusion with a wooden throne that once surrounded the stone. But the imaging analysis revealed something unexpected. Tool marks on the stone's surface dated to multiple periods. Geological specialists, examining the patterns of weathering and erosion, concluded that while the stone itself was certainly ancient, formed during the Devonian period approximately 400 million years ago, its current shape reflected working done at different times. Some tool marks appeared consistent with medieval techniques. Others seemed more recent, possibly dating to the late 13th century, precisely when the stone would have been seized by Edward I. More significantly, the team discovered traces of repair work that had been carefully concealed. Multiple cracks in the stone had been filled with sediment-based mortar at some point in its history, then obscured to make the repairs invisible. Chemical analysis of this mortar material suggested 13th century origin. Again, the period of Edward's invasion. The repairs were sophisticated, clearly done by craftsmen familiar with working sandstone, and deliberately camouflaged to avoid detection. The implications were tantalizing. If the stone had required repair work in the late 13th century, was this damage sustained during Edward's seizure or during an earlier substitution? The cracks could have resulted from rough handling by English soldiers, as traditional accounts suggest, or they could have resulted from hasty work by monks creating a substitute, a block of sandstone quarried and shaped under time pressure, transported hurriedly, and consequently damaged in ways the original never was. The geological analysis added another layer of mystery. The sandstone composition matched Perthshire quarries as expected, but specialists noted that the stone displayed weathering patterns inconsistent with having spent nearly 500 years housed indoors at Scone Abbey before 1296, followed by 700 years indoors at Westminster. The erosion suggested more extensive outdoor exposure than the official chronology would allow, unless the stone currently identified as the Stone of Destiny had been quarried, shaped, and allowed to weather outdoors for a period before being installed as either the original or a substitute. Research continued beyond the stone itself to archaeological investigation of Scone Abbey's ruins. Ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted in 2003 and 2011 mapped extensive underground structures beneath the Abbey complex, far more extensive than later building phases could explain. Several chambers detected by radar appeared to have been deliberately filled with rubble sometime in the medieval period, sealed against future access. When limited excavation was permitted in a small section identified by radar as containing a significant void, archaeologists discovered a tunnel entrance that had been carefully blocked with stones and sealed with mortar. Carbon dating of organic material in the mortar suggested closure around 1300. Within a few years of Edward's invasion, the tunnel extended approximately 40 feet before encountering a collapse that made further exploration impossible without extensive excavation that authorities refused to permit, citing structural concerns and the site's designation as a scheduled ancient monument. One discovery from this limited excavation sparked particular interest: a carved stone block bearing an 8-pointed star surrounding a crown, identical to the seal described in fragmentary manuscripts as belonging to the Custodes Lapidis. The block had been reused as fill material, suggesting a deliberate attempt to erase evidence of the order's existence. When the carving was compared with similar symbols found at other Scottish monastic sites, including Iona Abbey, Melrose Abbey, and Dunkeld Cathedral, a pattern emerged. The 8-pointed star appears at multiple locations connected to Scottish royal history, always in secondary locations, always partially obscured, as if those who carved it wished to mark significant sites without attracting attention. The analysis of the stone's iron rings proved equally revealing. These rings, positioned at each end to facilitate carrying, were subjected to metallurgical analysis. The iron was consistent with late medieval Scottish production, but the method of attachment suggested they had been added to the stone rather than being original features. Residue in the attachment points indicated multiple removals and reinstallations, as if the rings had been taken off and reattached several times. Why would such modifications be necessary unless the stone was being moved frequently during a specific period? Precisely what one would expect if it was being transported from hiding place to hiding place, or if a substitute stone was being prepared and the rings from the original transferred to it. Documentation discovered in archives previously considered exhaustively searched added unexpected corroboration. In 2007, a researcher examining unrelated materials at the Scottish National Archives discovered a letter from Abbot John of Scone to an unnamed recipient, dated March 1298, 2 years after Edward's seizure of the stone. The letter, written in code that required linguistic specialists 3 years to partially decrypt, contained a cryptic passage: "The shepherd's crook points to where the lost lamb sleeps. What the English king believes he holds, we know otherwise. The true seat awaits the rightful shepherd." The shepherd's crook reference led researchers to examine medieval carvings at sites associated with pastoral imagery. At Dunkeld Cathedral, a carved bishop's crozier in a wall niche pointed toward a specific architectural feature. When that feature was examined using modern scanning technology, a sealed void behind the masonry was detected. The cathedral chapter, which maintains jurisdiction over the site, declined permission for exploratory excavation, but acknowledged that medieval construction often included sealed chambers whose purposes have been lost. Perhaps the most dramatic discovery came not from physical archaeology, but from documentary research in unexpected quarters. In 2015, a specialist in medieval ciphers, working on encryption methods used by 13th century monastic orders, identified patterns in seemingly routine financial records from Scone Abbey, spanning 1280 to 1310. When these records were analyzed using statistical methods developed for detecting hidden messages in historical texts, a secondary layer of information emerged: encoded references to movements of the sacred burden and expenses for guarding the inviolate trust that did not correlate with any legitimate abbey activities but precisely matched what one would expect if a secret order was operating within or alongside the official monastic community. The cipher specialist, publishing findings in a limited circulation academic journal, noted that similar encoded passages appeared in financial records from several Scottish religious houses during the same period: Iona, Arbroath, Dunfermline, Kilwinning, all locations with documented connections to Scottish royal ceremonial or resistance to English occupation. The pattern suggested coordination across a network of institutions, all protecting or transmitting a shared secret. Modern analytical techniques also enabled comparison of the Stone of Destiny, With other ceremonial stones from Scotland's past, the stone used in Irish royal inaugurations at Tara, though now missing, was photographed and measured in the 19th century. When those measurements were compared with descriptions of the Scottish stone from before 1296, they matched more closely than they matched the current stone. This could support the theory that the Stone of Destiny genuinely did originate in Ireland as tradition claims, or it could support the theory that whoever created a substitute in 1296 was working from descriptions that emphasized Irish origin, making the substitute fit legendary expectations rather than replicating the actual stone. Archaeological work at sites beyond Scone provided additional context. Excavations at Castle Teorum in the Western Highlands, conducted between 2001 and 2005, uncovered a sealed chamber beneath the castle's medieval fortifications. Inside were the remains of what appeared to be a temporary shrine, with evidence of ritual activity dating to the late 13th century. Among the artifacts recovered was a fragment of red sandstone, approximately 8 inches square, bearing tool marks consistent with those on the Stone of Destiny. Carbon dating and geological analysis confirmed it was Perthshire sandstone matching the current stone's composition, suggesting that whoever prepared a substitute in 1296 had tested their work, creating sample pieces to ensure the forgery would be convincing. The cumulative effect of these discoveries, each individually interesting but potentially explainable as unrelated to the stone's history, was to reopen questions that 20th century historians had considered resolved. The Westminster Stone theory, dismissed as nationalist mythology by many scholars, found unexpected support from scientific evidence. The possibility that a secret order had orchestrated an elaborate substitution, once considered too conspiratorial to take seriously, now had to be evaluated against archaeological and documentary findings that suggested deliberate concealment of something significant. Yet definitive proof remained elusive. Each discovery pointed toward a pattern of covert activity, but none provided unambiguous confirmation that the stone now in Scotland was anything other than the stone Edward I seized in 1296. The Custodes Lapidus remained ghosts in the historical record, suggested by fragmentary evidence, implied by archaeological anomalies, but never conclusively documented in any source that could not be interpreted multiple ways. Specialists found themselves in the frustrating position of having more evidence than previous generations, yet still unable to answer the fundamental question: is the Stone of Destiny currently on display at Perth Museum the genuine article that Kenneth MacAlpin brought to Scone in 840, upon which Scottish kings were crowned for 4.5 centuries? Or is it an elaborate medieval forgery, crafted by desperate monks in 1296 to deceive Edward Longshanks, while the true stone remained, hidden somewhere in Scotland, its location perhaps lost even to those who concealed it? The scientific analysis provided no definitive answer. It confirmed that the stone was ancient, that it came from Scotland, that it had been modified and repaired at key moments in history. But whether those modifications represented careful maintenance of a genuine artifact or careful preparation of a convincing substitute, that question remained open, preserved in the ambiguity that medieval conspirators might have deliberately cultivated. What was certain was that the stone's history was more complex than traditional narratives suggested. Whether that complexity reflected the successful operation of a secret order dedicated to protecting Scotland's sovereignty through deception, or merely reflected the complicated preservation history of an object that changed hands violently and remained contested for centuries, depended on interpretation of evidence that could support either conclusion. The discovery phase had revealed anomalies, raised questions, identified patterns. But the deeper mystery, whether the Custodes Lapidus succeeded in their mission to substitute a fake stone for the real one, would require examination of what the historical record did not contain. The silences, the gaps, the absences that might represent successful erasure of evidence, rather than absence of events to record. Reconstructing the timeline of events surrounding the stone's seizure requires assembling evidence from sources that were never meant to be connected. English chronicles describing triumphant conquest, Scottish records maintaining studied silence, and fragmentary evidence suggesting activity that neither official narrative acknowledged. Modern historians, applying techniques developed for detecting covert operations in more recent history, have identified patterns in this fragmentary record that suggest deliberate coordination around a specific objective, ensuring that Edward I took a substitute stone while the genuine article remained hidden in Scotland. The timeline begins not in August 1296 when Edward's forces reached Scone, but months earlier when the direction of the English invasion became clear. According to English administrative records preserved in the National Archives at Kew, Edward ordered mustering of troops at Newcastle in March 1296, following Scotland's alliance with France and the Auld Alliance Treaty, signed in February. By April, the invasion was underway. Scottish forces were decisively defeated at the Battle of Dunbar on April 27th, leaving the path to Scotland's heartland open. This gave defenders at Scone approximately 3.5 months between the invasion's commencement and Edward's arrival at the Abbey in early August. For a prepared organization with pre-established contingency plans, this would have been sufficient time to execute a substitution scheme that required secrecy, not speed. The custodes lapidus, if they existed and if they had planned for this possibility, would not have waited until English soldiers appeared at the gates. They would have initiated their protocol the moment the Dunbar defeat made Edward's eventual reach of Scone inevitable. Evidence of unusual activity at Scone during these crucial months comes from sources that only became meaningful when examined retrospectively. Financial accounts from the Abbey, preserved in fragmentary form at the National Library of Scotland, show expenditures during May and June 1296 that deviate from normal patterns. Payments to stonemasons are recorded without corresponding building projects documented in Abbey records. Purchases of wool cloth and transport animals occur without usual accompanying documentation of what was being wrapped or transported. The Abbey's wine consumption increased dramatically, consistent with hosting visitors, though no formal visitations from other religious houses or nobles are recorded in the sparse chronicle entries from this period. Comparison with similar monastic financial records from other Scottish abbeys during the same period reveals that Scone's unusual spending patterns were not replicated elsewhere, except at 4 specific locations: Iona Abbey on the western coast, Arbroath Abbey on the east coast, Dunfermline Abbey to the south, and Kilwinning Abbey in Ayrshire. Each of these institutions, separated by considerable distances and ostensibly independent of one another, showed similar anomalies in their accounts during the spring and summer of 1296. Expenses that could be interpreted as supporting covert movement and sheltering of travelers, coordination of activities across a network, preparation of concealed storage, all appearing simultaneously, all at locations with direct or indirect connections to Scottish royal ceremonial. Archaeological evidence provides physical corroboration of timeline theories. At Dunsinane Hill, long associated in tradition with both Macbeth's fortress and with one of the alleged hiding places for the stone, excavations in the 1960s uncovered evidence of activity in the late 13th century that seemed inconsistent with the hill's status as an abandoned fortification. Charcoal from fires, fragments of iron tools, and disturbances to earlier archaeological layers all dated to approximately 1295–1300. When these findings were published, they were interpreted as evidence of temporary occupation by combatants during the Wars of Independence. But the pattern of disturbance suggested not military encampment, but focused excavation, digging into specific areas, moving substantial amounts of earth, then carefully refilling and disguising the work. The cave systems beneath and around Dunsinane were extensively explored by antiquarians in the 19th century, who reported finding chambers that appeared to have been deliberately sealed with stone blocks. Several of these sealed chambers were opened, revealing spaces that showed signs of medieval occupation but contained no artifacts or treasures, consistent with chambers that had been thoroughly cleaned after serving their purpose. One cave in particular, accessed through a concealed entrance, contained walls that had been carved with symbols matching those found at Scone and other sites associated with the custodies. 8 pointed stars, interlaced patterns, and cruciform designs that combined Christian and pre-Christian elements. Tracking the hypothetical movement of the stone from Scone to its ultimate hiding place requires understanding medieval Scotland's geography and the infrastructure available for covert transport. The most direct route from Scone to the Western Highlands or Islands would have followed ancient pathways through the mountains, avoiding major settlements where English sympathizers or agents might observe suspicious activity. These routes, documented in later Highland tradition and partially preserved in drove roads used for moving cattle, connected eastern monasteries with western strongholds through passes that could be traveled by those with local knowledge, but were easily defended against pursuit. Historical geographers analyzing medieval Scotland's transportation networks have identified a pattern of monastic foundations and noble holdings that form a chain from Scone westward through Perthshire into Argyll. At each link in this chain, properties existed where travelers could be sheltered and burdens transferred without attracting attention. Whether this network was designed specifically for moving the stone, or whether the custodes simply exploited existing connections is unclear, but the infrastructure necessary for covert movement certainly existed. The question of where the stone might have been taken, assuming the substitution theory is correct, has generated extensive speculation and limited concrete evidence. The 4 locations mentioned in fragmentary Custodes documents have each been investigated to varying degrees. Dunsinane Hill, as noted, shows signs of medieval activity, but has never yielded definitive evidence of containing or having contained the stone. Iona Abbey, Scotland's most sacred Christian site where many Scottish kings were buried, was thoroughly explored during 19th century restorations, without discovering any concealed chambers that might have held the stone, though several sealed crypts were identified but left unopened for religious and preservation reasons. Dunfermline Abbey, where Robert the Bruce would later be buried, underwent extensive archaeological investigation during 20th century conservation work. Ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted in 2008 identified anomalies beneath the abbey's nave that could represent sealed chambers, but the abbey's status as an active parish church and scheduled monument prevented invasive investigation. The site's significance for Scottish kingship, multiple monarchs were buried there, and the abbey served as an alternative ceremonial location when Scone was unavailable, makes it a plausible hiding place, but plausibility is not proof. Kilwinning Abbey in Ayrshire presents perhaps the most intriguing possibility. The abbey's ruins have never been comprehensively excavated, and significant portions remain buried beneath later construction. The abbey had strong connections to Scotland's resistance to Edward the Ferne, providing shelter to nobles who would later fight alongside William Wallace and Robert the Bruce. Local tradition persistently claims that something of great value was hidden in the abbey's crypts during the Wars of Independence, though the specifics have been lost to time. Modern magnetic surveys detected significant metal deposits beneath the ruins, but interpretation of these anomalies is disputed. They could represent concealed artifacts or merely iron fittings from collapsed architecture. The cryptic reference to the place where water and stone meet beneath the sign of the cross has never been definitively decoded, though researchers have proposed multiple interpretations. Some suggest it refers to the confluence of rivers near specific crosses erected in medieval Scotland to mark significant locations. Others interpret water and stone as references to wells or springs at rocky sites. Scotland has hundreds of such locations, many with pre-Christian sacred associations that continued into the Christian era. The most esoteric interpretation suggests the phrase is not geographical but metaphorical, referring to baptism and foundation, a concealed chamber beneath a baptistery, of which several existed in medieval Scottish churches. Attempting to verify any of these theories faces fundamental obstacles. Locations identified as possible hiding places are either legally protected from excavation, physically inaccessible without extensive resources, or so thoroughly destroyed by later construction that investigation would yield limited evidence even if permission were granted. This frustration led some researchers to propose that the Custodes deliberately chose hiding places where future discovery would be extremely difficult, a final safeguard ensuring that even if the existence of the genuine stone became known, locating it would remain effectively impossible. The timeline of Edward's activities after seizing the stone provides additional evidence that something about the capture troubled the English king. Edward departed Scotland in September 1296, carrying the stone and other Scottish regalia south to Westminster. But in 1298, he returned to Scotland with a military force and made a point of revisiting Scone Abbey, conducting a thorough search of the premises. English administrative records document that Edward personally supervised examination of the abbey's crypts and storage chambers, an unusual level of royal attention for what should have been a routine military operation. Why would Edward return to search Scone 2 years after already seizing the stone, unless he had reason to suspect he had not obtained the genuine article? Some historians interpret this merely as Edward's thoroughness in consolidating control over Scotland. But specialists in medieval political symbolism note that Edward's actions suggest uncertainty about the legitimacy of what he possessed. The English king was sophisticated enough to understand that a coronation stone's power derived partly from its authenticity. A fake would undermine rather than enhance claims to Scottish sovereignty. Scottish sources from the period are frustratingly silent about the stone's fate, which itself raises questions. The stone's seizure represented a catastrophic loss of one of Scotland's most sacred objects, yet contemporary Scottish chronicles, admittedly written under English occupation and later subject to censorship, barely mention it. This silence could reflect trauma, or it could reflect knowledge that made such discussion dangerous. If the substitution had occurred, publicizing it would have invited English raids to locate the genuine article. Silence served the custodes' purposes better than proclamation. The crucial moment for verifying the substitution theory would come in 1306, when Robert the Bruce was crowned King of Scots at Scone, without the Stone of Destiny, which remained at Westminster. Or did it? The chronicles record that Bruce was crowned according to ancient custom, but they do not specify whether this included sitting upon the stone. Isabella Macduff, who by family tradition held the right to place Scottish kings upon the stone, participated in Bruce's coronation, suggesting that at least some elements of the traditional ceremony were observed. If the custodes had successfully hidden the genuine stone, would they have revealed its location to Bruce, a rebel king fighting for survival with uncertain prospects of ultimate success? Or would they have maintained their protective silence, waiting for a moment when revelation would serve rather than endanger their mission? The historical record provides no answer, only the tantalizing fact that Bruce was crowned at Scone, despite lacking the stone Edward believed he controlled. A contradiction that traditional histories explain as Bruce making do without the necessary ceremonial object, but which could equally reflect secret possession of what English forces sought. The pattern that emerges from reconstructing this timeline is one of careful preparation, coordinated action across multiple locations, deliberate concealment followed by centuries of maintained silence, and sufficient success that even after 700 years, historians cannot definitively disprove the substitution theory. If the Custodes Lepidus accomplished what fragmentary evidence suggests, they executed one of medieval Europe's most successful covert operations, an intelligence operation disguised as religious observance, a rebellion enacted through deception rather than violence, a preservation of sovereignty achieved by making the occupying power believe it possessed what it actually lacked. The timeline will never be complete. Too many records were destroyed, too many witnesses maintained silence, too many participants took their knowledge to unmarked graves. But what can be reconstructed reveals a pattern consistent with organized resistance operating within the shell of defeated institutions, using the occupier's own triumph to conceal continuing defiance. The most telling evidence of the Custodes Lepidus's activities may be precisely what is missing from the historical record. When researchers examine medieval Scottish documents from the crucial period 1290–1310, they encounter not random gaps, but systematic absences, patterns of missing material that suggest deliberate removal rather than accidental loss. Understanding these gaps requires forensic examination of archival collections, paleographical analysis of what remains, and careful attention to what types of information survived and what disappeared. Monastic cartularies, the registers in which religious houses recorded property transactions, gifts, disputes, and significant events, provide the clearest evidence of systematic redaction. The cartulary of Scone Abbey survives only in fragments, with conspicuous gaps covering precisely the years when the custodes would have been most active. Folio leaves covering 1294–1299 are missing entirely from the register now held at the National Library of Scotland. When paleographers examined the binding, they found stub marks indicating pages were cut from the codex rather than simply lost to deterioration, a deliberate act requiring sharp tools and intentional removal. The pattern repeats at other monasteries in the suspected Custodes network. Iona Abbey's records show similar gaps for 1295–1300. Arbroath Abbey's cartulary is missing folios covering 1296–1302. Dunfermline Abbey's register has pages removed spanning 1295–1298. In each case, the missing material covers the specific years when, according to the substitution theory, Preparations for hiding the stone would have required coordination, travel, expenses, and communications that might leave traces in official records. What makes these gaps particularly suspicious is their consistency. Monastic records from Scottish abbeys not implicated in the custodes network show no similar pattern of missing pages from this period. Records from English monasteries are intact for these years. The lacunae appear specifically at institutions that other evidence suggests were involved in concealing the stone, and specifically during the years when such concealment would have been underway. More subtle forms of censorship are visible in records that survive. When specialists examined intact sections of Scone Abbey's cartulary, using multispectral imaging, a technique that can reveal text that has been erased or overwritten, they discovered that certain passages had been carefully scraped away using pumice or similar abrasives, then the parchment reused for innocuous entries. This was not random reuse of expensive parchment, a common medieval practice, but targeted obliteration of specific information. The few words that can be recovered from these erasures, revealed through digital reconstruction, include Latin terms suggesting payments, movements, and secrecy. Custodes, translatio, absconditum. Specialists translate these as guardians, transfer, and hidden. Precisely the vocabulary one would expect in records of the custodes' activities. But the fragments are too limited to provide definitive content. They merely confirm that information relating to guardianship, movement, and concealment was recorded and then deliberately erased. Royal records present their own anomalies. The Scottish Exchequer rolls, which documented crown revenues and expenditures, show unusual patterns during Robert the Bruce's early reign. Properties that should have been generating income, including former Templar lands and estates confiscated from nobles who supported the English, appear in some records, but not others. The Templars had been dissolved in 1312, and their Scottish properties officially transferred to the Knights Hospitaller. But accounting records show gaps and inconsistencies that suggest some Templar assets were diverted to undocumented purposes. This is significant because the Knights Templar had maintained close connections with Scottish royalty since their establishment in Scotland in 1128. Templar records, before their order's dissolution, show regular interactions with Scone Abbey and involvement in safeguarding royal regalia. Some historians have speculated that former Templars, displaced by their order's destruction but still possessing skills in intelligence and covert operations, might have been recruited into the custodes or provided expertise for hiding the stone. The timing is suggestive. Templars were arrested in France in October 1307, but Scotland, where Robert the Bruce had been excommunicated and was fighting for his kingdom's survival, did not enforce papal orders against the order. Former Templars in Scotland would have had motive, means, and opportunity to assist in protecting Scottish sovereignty symbols. Documentary gaps extend to correspondence between Scottish religious houses and Rome during this period. Papal archives contain remarkably few letters from Scottish abbeys between 1296 and 1310, a period when one would expect extensive communication regarding English occupation, political upheaval, and ecclesiastical appointments. The few letters that survive deal with routine administrative matters and carefully avoid mentioning anything that might be sensitive. This contrast with the usual volume of papal correspondence suggests that Scottish religious leaders either stopped writing to Rome, unlikely given their need for papal support, or that correspondence which might have revealed sensitive information was intercepted, destroyed, or removed from archives at a later date. Episcopal registers from Scottish dioceses show similar patterns. Bishops recorded ordinations, appointments, land transactions, and legal rulings, but several Scottish episcopal registers from the late 13th and early 14th centuries have pages missing that correspond to the critical period. The Register of the Bishop of St. Andrews, which should be the most complete given the see's importance, has mysterious gaps precisely during years when coordination between religious institutions would have been most intense. What survived provides negative evidence of what is carefully not mentioned. Financial accounts from Scottish monasteries during Bruce's reign contain cryptic entries that could relate to custodes' activities. Expenses for necessary but private purposes. Funds disbursed for protection of the sacred. Payments to brothers in service of the concealed trust. These phrases appear intermittently across multiple institutions' records, always without elaboration, always in contexts that provide no explanation of what was actually funded. Forensic accounting analysis, a modern technique applied to historical records, reveals patterns suggesting parallel accounting systems. Official abbey accounts show income and expenses that balance according to expected monastic activities. But when researchers totaled these accounts across all Scottish religious houses for which records survive, the aggregate figures suggested resources being generated that did not appear in corresponding expenditure records. The discrepancy is small, perhaps 5 to 7% of total documented revenues, but it is consistent across the years 1296 to 1315. This could represent simple accounting errors, or it could represent funds diverted to activities not recorded in official ledgers. The systematic nature of these gaps becomes even more apparent when examining chronicles written after the fact. Medieval chroniclers regularly copied from earlier sources, preserving information from documents that have since been lost. But when later Scottish chroniclers of the 14th and 15th centuries wrote about the stone's seizure by Edward I, they drew on sources that are now missing, and they wrote in ways that suggest those sources contained information too sensitive to repeat directly. Walter Bauer's Scotichronicon, compiled in the 1440s, includes a passage about the stone that has puzzled historians. What was taken to Westminster may have served English pride, but Scotland's ancient stone remains where ancient kings ordained it should be, known to those sworn to guard what must be protected. This cryptic statement appears to reference the substitution theory, but Bauer provides no source citation and no elaboration. When researchers examined Bauer's working manuscripts held at Cambridge University Library, they found marginal notes indicating he had consulted documents at Scone Abbey that were no longer accessible by his time, documents described as secret writings of the Guardians, now presumably lost or destroyed. Physical evidence of archival manipulation exists at multiple repositories. At the National Library of Scotland, curators maintain a collection of medieval manuscript fragments recovered from bookbindings during conservation work. Medieval and early modern bookbinders often reused parchment from older documents, cutting them into strips to reinforce spines or using sheets as protective covers. Several of these recovered fragments contain text relating to Scone Abbey and to events during the crucial period, but the fragments are small and the context has been lost. One fragment, recovered in 1947 from the binding of a 15th century legal text, contains a Latin passage that includes the phrase Fratres nigri custodientes lapidem verum contra falsum, the Black Brothers guarding the true stone against the false. The fragment is dated paleographically to the early 14th century, making it contemporary with events. But the larger document from which it was cut has never been located. Whether Black Brothers refers to the Black Friars, Dominicans, to the dark mantles worn by Templar sergeants, or to some other group is unclear, but the explicit reference to guarding the true stone against the false aligns precisely with the substitution theory. English records, though more complete than Scottish sources for this period, also show interesting gaps. Edward I's household accounts, generally meticulous, contain no detailed description of the stone's capture at Scone. The entry merely notes stones of Scotland being transported to Westminster, without specifying which stones or providing the careful descriptions one would expect for such an important symbolic seizure. Inventory documents created when the stone was installed in Westminster Abbey similarly lack detailed physical descriptions beyond basic dimensions, an omission that seems curious for an object of such importance. This absence becomes more significant when compared with English documentation of other Scottish regalia seized in 1296. The Scottish crown, scepter, and royal documents are described in careful detail in inventories, with measurements, materials, and decorative elements all recorded. Why was the stone treated differently with minimal description and documentation? Some historians suggest the stone's symbolic value made detailed documentation unnecessary. Everyone knew what the Stone of Destiny was, so extensive description seemed redundant. But this explanation is unsatisfying. Detailed documentation would have helped verify authenticity and prevent later questions about whether the correct stone had been seized. The pattern that emerges from these documentary gaps suggests not random loss, but targeted removal of information that might confirm or reveal the custode's activities. Records that would have shown preparations for hiding the stone, coordination between institutions, Expenses for covert operations and confirmation that a substitution occurred have been systematically eliminated from archives. What remains are fragments, cryptic references, and absences that together create a negative space in the historical record, a gap shaped like a successful conspiracy. Modern archival science recognizes that what archives preserve is as much a product of deliberate selection as of random survival. Documents that threatened powerful interests or revealed sensitive information were often removed from collections, sometimes immediately after events, sometimes decades or centuries later, when researchers might have examined them with new perspectives. The custodes' activities, if successful, would have generated exactly the types of documentary evidence that later generations would have had motive to suppress, whether this suppression was undertaken by the custodes themselves, destroying evidence to protect their secret, or by later authorities seeking to prevent the substitution theory from gaining credence, or by both at different times, cannot be determined from the evidence that survives. What can be stated is that the pattern of gaps is too consistent, too targeted, and too widespread to be explained by random document loss. The medieval period generated enormous quantities of written records, most of which survive in monastic, royal, and ecclesiastical archives. That material specifically relating to the stone's fate during the crucial years should be so systematically missing suggests deliberate action. The silences speak as loudly as the surviving texts. In the gaps between what was written and what remains, in the spaces where documents once existed but now do not, in the carefully obliterated passages and the missing pages, there the custodes lapidis left their most enduring mark. They understood that successful secrecy meant not leaving spectacular hidden manuscripts for future discovery, but ensuring that no manuscript survived to reveal what they had done. Their victory, if they achieved one, was written not in archives but in the very absence of archival evidence. An emptiness that cannot be filled, a silence that continues 7 centuries later. When historians attempt to reconstruct what happened to the Stone of Destiny in 1296, they face a fundamental problem. The few surviving accounts contradict each other in ways that cannot be explained by simple errors or different perspectives. English, Scottish, and ecclesiastical sources present incompatible narratives that, when mapped together, reveal not a single event viewed from multiple angles but what appears to be multiple different events, or a single event that was deliberately misrepresented in different ways to different audiences. English chronicles from the period treat the stone's capture as a straightforward military seizure. The Chronicle of Lanercost, written from a northern English perspective sympathetic to Edward I, describes the king's triumphant entry into Scone Abbey in August 1296. According to this account, Edward's soldiers seized the stone along with other Scottish regalia, encountering no resistance from the abbey's monks. The chronicler emphasizes the stone's symbolic importance to Scottish kingship and notes that its removal represented the ultimate demonstration of Edward's conquest. Scotland had lost not merely its political independence, but the physical mechanism through which legitimate sovereignty could be claimed. The Lanercost chronicler provides details that seem to confirm he was describing an actual event. The date of the seizure, the names of English nobles who accompanied Edward to Scone, the dimensions of the stone, and the method by which it was transported south to Westminster. Yet the description contains a curious detail. The chronicler notes that the stone appeared to be of common workmanship, not adorned as one might expect of so sacred a relic. This observation, preserved in a chronicle generally enthusiastic about English victories, raises the question of whether the author is subtly acknowledging that the captured stone seemed less impressive than legendary descriptions might have suggested. Scottish sources from the same period present a different picture, or rather, they present no picture at all, which itself is revealing. The few Scottish chronicles that survive from the late 13th and early 14th centuries were written under English occupation or shortly thereafter, making them cautious about explicitly challenging English narratives. But their treatment of the stone's fate is remarkable for what they do not say rather than what they do. The Chronicle of Melrose, compiled at Melrose Abbey in the Scottish borders, mentions Edward's invasion and the fall of Scottish independence, but makes no reference to the stone being taken to Westminster. This omission seems extraordinary given the stone's symbolic significance. The chronicler records other humiliations inflicted on Scotland: the forced abdication of King John Balliol, the removal of Scottish royal records, the oaths of fealty extracted from Scottish nobles, but passes over the stone's seizure in silence. Either the event seemed less significant than modern historians assume, or there was reason not to record it accurately. The Chronicle of Fordun, compiled by John of Fordun in the late 14th century based on earlier sources, provides the most enigmatic Scottish account. Fordun mentions the stone but in ambiguous terms. Edward carried away what he believed to be the coronation stone of the Scots kings, but whether he obtained the true stone or was deceived by the appearance of another, none can say with certainty, for the monks of Scone maintain silence on this matter, and secrets kept by the faithful are not lightly revealed. This passage, written decades after the events, explicitly acknowledges the substitution theory as a contemporary question rather than later speculation. Fordun's phrasing, what he believed to be, and whether he obtained the true stone, suggests that uncertainty about the captured stone's authenticity existed from the beginning. His reference to secrets kept by the faithful implies that some people knew the truth but deliberately refused to reveal it. Ecclesiastical records add a third perspective that complicates the narrative further. Vatican archives contain correspondence between Scottish bishops and Rome during this period, though, as noted earlier, much less than would be expected given the political crisis Scotland faced. One letter that survives, written by the Bishop of Dunblane to Pope Boniface VIII in 1298, contains a cryptic passage. The sacred symbols of Scottish sovereignty have been preserved through the providence of God and the dedication of faithful servants, even as temporal power has been lost. What appears to have been taken may serve the purposes of those who would preserve what must not be lost. This carefully worded statement could be interpreted multiple ways. It might simply mean that Scottish sovereignty as a concept survived despite losing its physical symbols, a spiritual rather than literal preservation. But the phrasing, what appears to have been taken, and faithful servants, suggests something more concrete, that the stone had been protected through deception, and that church officials knew about this but were communicating in code to avoid alerting English authorities who might intercept correspondence. Comparing these divergent accounts reveals patterns that suggest deliberate misinformation. English sources are confident and detailed, describing an unambiguous capture of the Scottish coronation stone. Scottish sources are either silent or ambiguous, neither confirming nor denying the English version but hinting at hidden knowledge. Ecclesiastical sources suggest that church authorities possessed information they were not sharing openly. Together, these accounts do not form a coherent narrative, but rather a collection of incompatible versions, exactly what one would expect if a substitution had occurred and different parties were presenting different versions to serve their own interests.